Gaming in 2025 has never looked better, but somehow, some of the most unforgettable RPG experiences were on a gray plastic console from the late 90s. These games don't survive because of nostalgia alone. They survive because their systems, stories, and design philosophies were built with intention. We're looking at PS1 RPGs that still feel shockingly playable, meaningful, games you can boot up right now and get completely lost in. Arc the Lad 2 is one of those sequels that quietly fixes everything people criticized about the original. While the first game felt brief and somewhat bare bones, the second entry explodes into a much more ambitious tactical RPG that feels shockingly modern for a late-era PS1 title. In fact, a lot of players who bounce off the first game are stunned by how much deeper, darker, and more complex it becomes just a few hours in. At its core, this is a grid-based strategy RPG, but the way it handles pacing sets it apart. Battles are fast, responsive, and rarely waste your time. Maps are compact, but cleverly designed, forcing you to think about positioning, elevation, and enemy aggro without drowning you in endless filler encounters. It feels closer to a streamlined, narrative-driven tactics experience than the slower, grind-heavy approach many of its contemporaries took. The story is where this really shines. Instead of focusing on a single heroic journey, it weaves together multiple character arcs across different regions and political factions. Themes of war, revenge, class struggle, and moral compromise run throughout the narrative, and the game isn't afraid to let situations end badly. Characters make mistakes, plans fall apart, and the consequences linger. For a PS1 RPG, that level of narrative ambition was rare. Progression is also surprisingly nuanced. Characters grow not just through levels, but through skill usage and equipment evolution. Certain abilities unlock only after repeated use, encouraging you to stick with characters long enough to see their full potential. Some units evolve dramatically over time, both mechanically and narratively, which makes long-term investment feel rewarding. What's especially frustrating in hindsight is how overlooked this game was outside Japan. By the time Arc the Lad Collection arrived in the West, the PS1 was already nearing the end of its life. But even now, Arc the Lad 2 holds up as one of the strongest examples of how tactical RPGs could blend storytelling and gameplay without sacrificing momentum. The Legend of Legaia stood out on the PS1 because it refused to play by the usual rules of turn-based combat. While most RPGs of the era relied on menus and passive command selection, Legaia demanded active input, blending fighting game logic directly into its battle system. And even now, that decision makes it feel completely different from almost anything else on the platform. Instead of choosing attack and watching the animation play out, you input directional commands to form combo strings known as arts. Different sequences trigger different attacks, and discovering new ones becomes a game in itself. There's a genuine sense of experimentation here, where learning happens organically through play rather than tutorials. The more you engage with the system, the more expressive and powerful your characters become. That mechanical creativity is reinforced by the progression systems. Equipment matters, but so does how you fight. Characters unlock new arts by using certain patterns repeatedly, and the Razaru system adds another layer by granting passive bonuses and special abilities tied to magical living armor. Choosing which Razaru to level isn't just a stat decision. It fundamentally alters how a character performs in combat. The world itself is bleak, almost post-apocalyptic, with humanity trapped under a suffocating mist that spawns monsters and isolates civilizations. It's a setting that feels oppressive by design, and that tone carries through the story. It's slow, serious, and often melancholic. While the visuals are unmistakably late 90s, the art direction gives the game a distinct identity that still holds together decades later. It may not have achieved the same legendary status as some of its peers, but The Legend of Legaia remains one of the most mechanically daring RPGs on the PS1. And that boldness is exactly why it still feels worth playing in 2025. Lunar 2, Eternal Blue is one of those sequels that deepens the entire identity of its world. While the first Lunar laid the foundation with charm and sincerity, it takes that framework and pushes it into more emotionally complex territory. It's still colorful and upbeat on the surface, but underneath that warmth is a story about legacy, loss, and the weight of history repeating itself. What makes this stand out even now is its character writing. The cast feels unusually human for a PS1 era RPG, with motivations that evolve naturally as the story progresses. Relationships shift, loyalties are tested, and characters are allowed to grow in ways that feel earned rather than scripted. Dialogue is expressive without being bloated, and the game frequently uses quieter moments to build emotional impact instead of relying solely on big dramatic set pieces. The combat system looks traditional at first glance, but it hides a surprising amount of tactical depth. Battles take place on a visible field where positioning matters. Characters physically move toward enemies to attack, and the distance between units directly affects which skills and spells can be used. Area of effect abilities reward smart spacing, while poor positioning can get your party punished fast. This adds a subtle layer of planning that keeps encounters engaging across a very long runtime. Progression is paced deliberately. New abilities unlock steadily. Equipment choices matter, and bosses often demand that you rethink your setup rather than brute force your way through. It's not a brutally hard game, but it expects attention. World building is another area where Eternal Blue shines. Towns feel alive, NPC dialogue evolves as events unfold, and small story threads pay off hours later. It's the kind of RPG that encourages talking to everyone because the world feels worth listening to, and this remains a reminder that longevity in RPGs isn't about scale alone.
Someday, I'll gather enough information.
Wild Arms 2 is one of those sequels that quietly improves on almost everything while somehow never escaping the shadow of its predecessor. While the first Wild Arms is often remembered for its novelty and tone, the second game doubles down on ambition, pushing its narrative, mechanics, and themes into much darker and more complex territory. The Western fantasy aesthetic is still front and center, but it uses that setting to explore ideas most RPGs of its era avoided. This is a story about ideology, extremism, and the moral cost of believing you're doing the right thing. The villains aren't cartoonishly evil, and the heroes aren't spotless saviors. Everyone is carrying baggage, and the game takes its time unpacking it. For a late 90s RPG, the writing is surprisingly introspective, often questioning whether saving the world is worth the damage left behind. Combat builds on the original's turn-based foundation with more layers and flexibility. Each character brings a unique toolkit to the party, and battles feel faster and more reactive than you might expect. The Force system rewards smart play by letting you unleash powerful abilities when your gauge fills, but timing those moments correctly is crucial. Blow it too early and you'll regret it later. Save it too long and you might not get another chance. Dungeon design also deserves credit. Puzzles are woven directly into exploration rather than feeling like distractions, and the tool-based mechanics encourage experimentation instead of brute force. Combined with a soundtrack that effortlessly shifts between melancholy, tension, and triumph, Wild Arms 2 creates an atmosphere that still lands emotionally decades later. Now that it's accessible on modern platforms, it's easier than ever to revisit or finally experience a game that took real narrative risks at a time when most RPGs played it safe. It may not have the loudest legacy, but once it hooks you, it doesn't let go. The original Suikoden is easy to dismiss at a glance, especially if you've already played the sequel and heard everyone call that one the masterpiece. But going back to the first game in 2025, what really stands out is how confident and focused it is. This isn't a bloated RPG trying to overwhelm you with systems. It's a tightly paced political fantasy that knows exactly what it wants to do and wastes very little time doing it. The core hook is the 108 Stars of Destiny, a massive cast of recruitable characters that slowly transform your humble base into a full-fledged headquarters. What makes this more than just a gimmick is how naturally these characters fit into the world. Some become shopkeepers or strategists, others join your party, and a few even affect the outcome of major story moments. Watching your castle evolve as a reflection of your choices gives the game a sense of progression that feels incredibly satisfying, even by modern standards. Combat sticks to classic turn-based roots, but it mixes things up with multiple battle formats. Standard party encounters are quick and efficient, while one-on-one duels introduce mind game mechanics that rely on reading your opponent's intentions. Large-scale army battles shift perspective entirely, turning conflicts into simplified tactical engagements that reinforce the story's growing scope. These constant changes in structure prevent the game from ever feeling repetitive. What really elevates Suikoden, though, is its willingness to let consequences stick. Certain characters can permanently die if key moments go wrong, and others are missable entirely. The game doesn't announce these outcomes or give you convenient second chances. That sense of loss, of things not always going perfectly, adds weight to the narrative in a way few PS1 RPGs dare to attempt. Even today, this feels surprisingly modern in how it treats player choice. Vandal Hearts is one of those strategy RPGs that immediately tells you what kind of game it is: ruthless, efficient, and completely uninterested in holding your hand. It arrived before tactical RPGs became mainstream on consoles, and because of that, it often gets overlooked today. But once you actually sit down and play it, it becomes obvious just how sharp its design really is. What separates this from many other grid-based RPGs is its pacing. Battles move fast. There's no excessive animation padding, no drawn-out enemy turns, and no sense that the game is wasting your time. Every map feels tightly constructed, almost like a chess problem, where positioning matters just as much as raw stats. Elevation, choke points, and terrain advantages aren't optional considerations. They're the difference between winning cleanly and watching your squad get wiped out in 2 turns. The class system is deceptively simple, but that simplicity is part of its strength. Units don't endlessly branch into dozens of interchangeable roles. Instead, promotions feel meaningful and permanent. When a character advances, their appearance changes, their capabilities shift, and your overall strategy has to adapt around them. There's no respec button to bail you out, so every decision carries weight. That sense of commitment is something modern games often avoid, but here it's exactly what makes the experience so tense and rewarding. Narratively, Vandal Hearts leans into a grounded, war-torn political story rather than high fantasy spectacle. It's about betrayal, corruption, and the human cost of power struggles, and it doesn't shy away from uncomfortable turns. The tone is bleak without being melodramatic, and that seriousness helps the battles feel like more than just abstract strategy puzzles. Even in 2025, it stands out as a tactical RPG that respects the player's intelligence and refuses to soften its edges. Final Fantasy IX stands as one of the most confident and complete RPGs ever released on the PlayStation 1. While its cartoonish art style initially divided fans, that choice turned out to be its greatest strength. By embracing a timeless storybook aesthetic instead of chasing realism, it avoided aging the way many of its contemporaries did. At its heart, this is a celebration of the series' roots. Medieval fantasy towns, airships, crystal mythology, and clearly defined character roles all harken back to the franchise's earliest entries. But this isn't nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. The game pairs that classic structure with some of the most emotionally resonant writing Square ever produced. Each party member is given space to grow, struggle, and change. Arcs aren't rushed, and they're woven naturally into the main narrative instead of being confined to optional side content. Mechanically, it emphasizes commitment. Abilities are tied to equipment, forcing players to make meaningful trade-offs between raw stats and long-term growth. You might wear weaker gear just to permanently learn a skill, creating a constant push and pull between short-term survival and future flexibility. The trance system adds bursts of power, but its automatic activation means timing isn't always in your control, reinforcing the game's focus on adaptability rather than perfect optimization. The pacing is remarkably strong for a long RPG. Major story beats are spaced evenly, side content feels purposeful, and the world itself invites exploration without overwhelming the player. With modern ports offering speed-up options and visual enhancements, this is more accessible than ever. More than anything, FF9 endures because it understands what makes RPGs meaningful. Not spectacle, not complexity for its own sake, but characters, themes, and a world that feels lovingly crafted from start to finish. Chrono Cross is one of the most ambitious RPGs ever released on the PlayStation 1, and also one of the most misunderstood. Released late in the console's lifespan, it wasn't interested in being a straightforward sequel to Chrono Trigger. Instead, it chose to explore parallel worlds, fractured identities, and the unintended consequences of past choices, themes that feel even more relevant today than they did at launch. The combat system immediately sets this apart. Rather than relying on traditional turns and MP management, it uses a stamina-based system where every action consumes a shared resource. Light attacks build accuracy and stamina efficiency, while stronger skills drain more resources and demand better timing. On top of that, elemental abilities influence a shared battlefield, where stacking the same element can dramatically alter the flow of combat. Every encounter becomes a small tactical puzzle. The massive cast is another defining feature. With over 40 recruitable characters, it gives players an unprecedented level of variety. Not every character is deeply developed, but the sheer diversity in abilities, elemental affinities, and personalities makes party composition feel endlessly flexible. Discovering who you can recruit and under what conditions becomes part of the game's identity. Narratively, it's dense and unapologetically complex. It doesn't spoon-feed explanations or wrap everything up neatly. Instead, it trusts players to connect dots across timelines, dimensions, and character perspectives. Some moments hit emotionally precisely because the game allows ambiguity to linger rather than resolving everything cleanly. The remastered version had a rough start, but post-launch patches significantly improved performance, making it easier than ever to revisit this classic on modern hardware. Chrono Cross may not be comfortable, simple, or universally appealing, but that's exactly why it has appeal. Saga Frontier 2 feels less like a traditional RPG and more like an interactive storybook that happens to include combat. Even today, it stands apart visually thanks to its hand-painted watercolor backgrounds and delicate sprite work. While many PS1 RPGs chased realism or flashy effects, it committed fully to an illustrated aesthetic. And that commitment is exactly why it hasn't aged a day. But this isn't just style over substance. Underneath that beautiful presentation is one of the most experimental RPG structures Square ever released in the West. Instead of following a single protagonist from start to finish, the game tells two parallel stories across generations, jumping forward and backward in time. You're not just watching history unfold, you're actively filling in its gaps. Combat is turn-based, but it operates on a philosophy that's very different from traditional leveling systems. Characters don't gain experience points in the usual sense. Instead, growth is tied directly to action. Swing swords often, and sword techniques evolve. Cast spells repeatedly, and magic expands organically. New abilities can spark mid-battle, rewarding experimentation rather than grinding. This system gives every fight a sense of discovery. You're never just going through the motions. There's always the chance that something new will trigger. Combined with the game's timeline-based structure, this creates a rhythm where combat and storytelling reinforce each other rather than competing for attention. This also doesn't hold your hand. It expects you to piece together events, motivations, and consequences on your own. That can be intimidating at first, but it's also what gives the game its depth. The narrative feels like a historical epic rather than a linear quest, and that sense of scale makes even small moments feel meaningful. With its modern remaster smoothing out rough edges while preserving the original art style, Saga Frontier 2 is easier than ever to revisit. Kodelka is one of the strangest, boldest RPGs to ever land on the PlayStation 1, and that's exactly why it still feels so compelling today. Instead of chasing fantasy spectacle, it leans hard into psychological horror, grounding its entire experience inside a decaying Welsh monastery filled with rot, secrets, and things that should not exist. The result is an RPG that feels more like an interactive Gothic novel than a traditional adventure. What immediately sets it apart is its atmosphere. Fixed camera angles, pre-rendered backgrounds, and dim lighting give it a survival horror presentation closer to early Silent Hill than Final Fantasy. But instead of action-based combat, encounters shift into turn-based battles fought on a small grid. Positioning matters, movement costs turns, and careless decisions can quickly spiral into disaster. It's slow by modern standards, but that deliberate pacing reinforces the tension rather than undermining it. The story is where this truly earns its legacy. It tackles themes most RPGs of the era avoided entirely: religious hypocrisy, trauma, scientific obsession, and the long shadow of historical cruelty. The writing feels unusually mature, and the dialogue often carries a sharp, uncomfortable edge. Kodelka herself is a standout protagonist, as she feels far removed from the wide-eyed heroes that dominated PS1 RPGs. Combat progression is intentionally restrained. Characters don't balloon into unstoppable forces, and resources remain scarce throughout much of the game. Magic use carries real risk. Firearms are powerful but limited, and melee combat demands careful positioning. It's not a power fantasy, and that's the point. The game wants you to feel vulnerable. Kodelka never received a remaster, and its stiff animations and slow combat won't appeal to everyone. But for players willing to meet on its own terms, it remains a rare example of a console RPG that fully commits to horror, not as a gimmick, but as its core identity.